maybe some of what Mao did was actually good. We think the reality for the millions of victims of these people is that what was done to them was monstrous. We think you undermine their suffering when you recognise any redeeming qualities of that person. When you're talking about Hitler and you only demonise like the Holocaust while actually recognising that like maybe he did good things earlier on, we think that that massively undermines the suffering of the Jewish people. We don't want to talk about these people as having any redeeming qualities. We don't want to pretend that there is any debate over the justification of what they did. Because if you recognise that there is like some redeeming qualities, there will always be people who weight the potentially good things we're talking about, or the circumstances they were in, over the horrors of the actions they committed. That's not a debate that we want people having. We don't think it is a situation where we ever want people to say that any actions of these villains were legitimate. Secondly, we think if you don't use words that create moral condemnation like monster, or like the words that Other House wanted to use, which is evil, instead, we think that creates like probably the same moral condemnation. You remove some degree of moral responsibility from that person. When you say Hitler was just like a victim of his circumstances, rather than like an objectively evil person, I think that massively undermines the like entire racial group that he just about destroyed. We think that that massively undermines their suffering. What did they want to say? They said reconciliation is harder when states pin blame on a monster rather than the state failing. We said that's just not true, right? Like again, coming back to the way that Germany recovered from World War II, we think that states question how they ever let a monster get into power. We think that there is a massive amount of like contrition from states that have given power to a monster because they recognise that as a people they failed in allowing that person to ever come to power. You actually get much greater regret when you recognise that that person was objectively evil and as a state you failed in allowing them to get into power. I think that's especially true when you're talking about things like colonialism. If you can say that you failed as a state in allowing that to happen, then that's much more useful than saying there are possibly redeeming qualities of this leader that did horrible things. Secondly, then why is it so valuable to use language like monster? We told you it creates a social cost around being associated with those ideas. So it's much harder to publicly be a neo-Nazi when that inspires like an instinctive reaction from everyone around you that that is evil, that is monstrous. They told you that that's really bad because then neo-Nazis will go underground. Firstly, we say underground is probably a much better place for neo-Nazis to be. We would rather have them like hide their views and not be able to publicly express those hateful views than to have any kind of acceptance of that publicly. But secondly, it means that you can never publicly endorse those views. That means you can't get political parties that espouse those views ever getting power. You can't get public figures being hateful in ways that are reminiscent of Hitler or reminiscent of Stalin, because there is an instinctive reaction from the population to shut that down. That is important both for ensuring that those things never happen again, but also for protecting the rights of those victims who are re-traumatized every time neo-Nazis get some kind of say in society or get some kind of platform to speak from. They then wanted to say that like the causes of things like neo-Nazism is poverty. Or we say that like there are thousands or millions of poor people who are not neo-Nazis, that it's disgusting to pin that on it. We want to make it utterly unacceptable in society to espouse any kind of view which is reminiscent of these kind of villains. You do that through language like monster, proud to oppose.
I thank the third speaker of the negative for her speech. I'd like to welcome the negative replies, James.
Easy answer to an easy question, they tell us. If I was a classroom teacher and a student asked me, why did Hitler do what he did? Or how would you describe Hitler? I could say Hitler was a monster. The question then is, how did a monster ever come to power in Germany? How was he ever popularly elected? What were the conditions that led to a monster emerging? Those are the intuitive questions that we have discussion about in classrooms all the time. So their case ran in the face of reality. This was a team that wanted to be inclusive. They didn't want to marginalize neo-Nazis, but they also didn't want to open the discussion about those types of views. You cannot not marginalize people, because at the point that you include those people in that discussion, the necessary corollary of that is that perhaps there is some merit in your views such that we are discussing them, such that we're having debate about them. We didn't want that debate in the first place, and that's why we proposed. I firstly want to look in this reply at the issue of victims, which has been woefully addressed by that side of the House. Secondly, I want to look at discourse. The point about victims, because they essentially bypassed this discussion at first speaker, and I gave you a conception that was quite different, which was that monster and terms like that are the only terms that don't do a disservice to victims in recognising the moral weight of their suffering. It'll lead to re-victimisation at the point where you open that discussion, where you open that debate and that discourse. What was their response to this? They said, all that victims care about is accuracy, and that we were jeopardising accuracy on this side of the House. We had a number of responses to that. And the first one was in my speech, which was that to victims, the most important group as a result of their suffering, the word monster was accurate, that did represent the moral weight of their suffering, and that should have been enough in this debate. But also, the response that they gave you relied on their point that we couldn't discuss causal factors in absent, or when we use the word monster, which we gave you a lot of analysis as to why you could still discuss those causal factors. Thirdly, we said that at the point where you validate that debate, you essentially say that there is legitimacy in the views of some of those people, and that was harmful to victims as well. Second question, what was the effect on discourse? Because the core of their case was that you needed to understand those causal factors that led to monsters emerging, and that using that term meant that we couldn't understand those causal factors. We rejected this right down the line, and we said that this wasn't a trade-off that we currently have. But we went further at second, which is to say that the word monster was actually useful for promoting further discussion. That people wanted to know about how monsters, such as Hitler, such as Stalin, could ever emerge in the context in which they emerged. How did they ever get elected? How did they ever come to power? We gave you further analysis about the social cost that we created, which means that you put a cap on the political possibility of those current day movements like Golden Dawn in Greece. What did they say? At third, they were like, oh, but if you go to a meeting and you're considered a monster, then you may as well just stay in that group because you're never going to shake that tag. Probably never go to the meeting in the first place. And that was the analysis that we gave you down the line, which was that when people have this simple cognitive association that associates those extremist parties with being monsters, they are far less likely to ever engage with them and to ever consider them as legitimate political entities. What else did they say? They said marginalization is bad. They said that neo-Nazis are in part neo-Nazis due to being poor. What did we tell you? That's essentially the type of rhetoric that we had a problem with this in this debate. The idea that you could simply only focus on causal factors and ignore the actual evil in those views. Because it's not true that all poor people are neo-Nazis, and it's the case that if you think that ethnic cleansing is legitimate, it's not because you're in poverty, it's because you are a monster. It's because if you hold that type of view, that's entirely illegitimate, and we're perfectly happy to condemn those people on that basis. The same went for the supporters of Mao. They said that they didn't want to open up the debate, but the problem was that if you included these people in the political discussion, if you said that we should not marginalise those people, that there is some merit in what they're saying, the only consequence of that is that the debate opens up. Because you can't have it both ways in this debate. You can't say that we're not going to condemn these people in the strongest possible terms while simultaneously saying we don't want to open up that debate, because it's a natural consequence of this policy. I described at first speaker the actions of Pol Pot, I described the actions of Hitler. Just because I did that doesn't mean that Hitler's not a monster. I think he's a monster, we should all think he's a monster. It doesn't mean we can't have this debate, which we're now having.
I thank the negative reply for her speech, and I'd like to welcome the reply speaker for the affirmative, Nick. Here.
Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. We wanted extreme condemnation of the Holocaust, and we wanted extreme condemnation of Hitler. What we didn't want was to neglect how humanity can be evil. The word monster says that Hitler was not a human. That means you cannot analyse the factors that led him to behave in the way that he did. Because the analysis that was brought to you with the different speakers of the negative team was analysis of the political factors that led individual people to vote for Hitler. It was not analysis of how humanity in the form of Hitler could behave in a sense that was evil. Because you tell people that that is something that we cannot understand when you use the word monster. That prevents us from trying to understand people in the future. And that's why we couldn't describe people as monsters. Because they weren't monsters. They were humans who did terrible things. We needed to understand that they were humans to understand that other humans could do bad things like that in the future. That's why we hated the word monster. 2 questions in this reply speech. Firstly, why does the word monster undermine truth in history? And secondly, why does the word monster undermine recovery? Firstly, why does the word monster undermine truth in history? The word monster inherently, as we described at third affirmative, says that it is something incomprehensible, that you can't understand and shouldn't try to understand. That means people don't investigate the causes that led to someone behaving that way. To some extent, we think that crowds out people looking at alternative factors, like the Treaty of Versailles, which caused Germans in general to be supportive of the Nazi Party. But to a much greater extent, and this was the important material in the debate, it prevents us from analysing the figures themselves and the things that caused that behaviour. We had a really big problem with that. That didn't mean we were acknowledging that there was anything good about Hitler or the thing that he did. We were just acknowledging that he was a human with 23 chromosomes, which is the correct biological term, I think. The next thing to observe is that they necessarily subsumed people into a single narrative. Again, this is why it was important to recognise that these